the Spirit Sessions podcast. I'm your guide, Katie Silcox, bringing you your weekly self-love soundbite. Join us, where I'll help you find your true spiritual home, where every single aspect of you is holy ground, holy ground, holy ground, holy ground.
This is a Spirit Session podcast with Katy Silcox. Venga chicos, empezamos.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hi everyone, Katie here. This podcast is intended to inspire you, educate you, and most importantly, support you on your journey towards knowing who you really are, that inner self, that inner teacher. I am not a psychologist or a medical doctor and do not offer professional health or medical advice on this podcast. If you are suffering from any kind of psychological or medical issue, please do the right thing and seek help from your qualified health professional.
Hello, and welcome to Spirit Sessions. You can probably tell from my voice that I am not your typical Ayurveda gal Friday, Katy Silcox, although I am also an Ayurveda gal. My name is Eva, and I'm Katie's podcast manager and a graduate of the Shakti School. I'm very excited to introduce you to today's podcast guest. In today's episode, Katy is interviewing Buddhist journalist and author Katy Butler. Katy Butler is the author of 2 powerful books, Knocking on Heaven's Door, The Path to a Better Way of Death, and The Art of Dying Well, a practical guide to a good end of life. Her books combine memoir and investigative reporting. They examine how our culture has over-medicalized death and lost touch with its sacredness. Katy's a former student of the late Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who gave her the Dharma name True Lotus. She is currently working on a new memoir about the spiritual and political experience of living in a vulnerable woman's body in our modern times. Katy's writing has appeared in many well-known publications, from the New York Times Magazine to the Buddhist Review, and her first book was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. So, you do not want to miss this episode. But before I hand over the mic to Katy, I want to let you know that enrollment for the 2025 class of our Ayurveda school is closing soon. Our live classes kicked off a few weeks ago, so when you enroll, you'll have instant access to those first few classes. And the course is a year long, so you'll have plenty of time to get caught up. If you're feeling called to dive deep into all things feminine form Ayurveda, Tantra, and women's health, with a community of like-minded souls, I want to invite you, dear listener, to join us. You can learn more about our online Ayurveda school and register through the link in the show notes. All right, without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
Welcome, Katy, and welcome everyone to Spirit Sessions. I am so honored to be in conversation with you today around some topics that are really potent, and I think something that we probably agree doesn't get a lot of press, and we're all a little bit timid to speak about. We have the amazing author and teacher, and you just told me 76 years old, Katy Butler is here with us today, radiating her thick mane of goddess hair. I'm like, can we not talk about death and sex and food? Can we talk about your hair routine? Just this radiant 76-year-old here with us today. And I actually found you really organically, and my intuition sort of piped up when I read an article that you wrote for the Buddhist Review, Tricycle, where you spoke about having a secret life. And Katy, if you'll indulge me, you're an amazing writer. She says, the strange thing about my difficulties with food is that I'd eaten so much and enjoyed so little. Cheap chocolates shoplifted from supermarkets as a lonely middle schooler, a jar of peanut butter spoon by spoon until I was stultified. after my first love returned to Venezuela to be a fruitarian. And I could just read the whole thing. It's sublime. And that's when I said, oh, this is like a sister from another mister. Katie, welcome to Spirit Sessions. And I think my first question for you is, how did you get into your own self-awareness practices? You're now 76, you've written books, you've studied, you've practiced, you've retreated. How did it all begin?
Oh, thank you so much. I love these questions already. I stumbled into San Francisco's Zen Center when I was 28. I was camping with a friend in Central California, and we'd heard about this hot springs that was deep in the Ventana wilderness. And so we went to use the hot springs. And I discovered that this was actually a small monastic community nestled down a 17-mile dirt road in the most beautiful, rugged countryside you can imagine. And it turned out a friend of mine who'd sort of disappeared from the San Francisco leftist writers scene was a full-time student there in a robe, etc. And I walked into that zendo one morning, and I went through probably an hour and a half of sitting, probably very uncomfortable, and then a whole bunch of chanting in Japanese that I couldn't understand. And I came out, and the world was so alive to me. It was like my mind was clear. I loved being alive. I could see everything. It was almost like you could see the outlines on every leaf kind of feeling, but also just this burgeoning joy and happiness and connection with everything. And I just was very, very hungry for more of that. And that was really the beginning. And so it didn't come, a lot of people come to Buddhism through books. You know, they pick up Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, or Pema Chodron, somebody. But for me, it really was through the body and through the experience of practicing. And I was just kind of hooked. And I think Tassajara was very special because the austerity of the Zen practice was so deeply balanced by the power of the natural environment there, you know, rugged mountains, a stream you could hear all the time. I mean, the world was so devoid of any mechanical noise and so alive. So that was the beginning. Do you want to hear any more, or shall I stop there and let you ask a question? Yeah.
I want to hear everything. I want to have a 7-hour conversation with you, and I want to tell you my story. But I also want to try to really stay into these two themes that I'm hungry to explore today with you. And one is, the article that you wrote talked about being in a retreat setting and and I don't remember it perfectly, but in a meditative setting. And there's this really funny story about the Zen master being like asking questions, and you'd respond and he'd be like, too much ego, go back. And I laughed out loud, you know, and then there you are, like eating this like sticky rice. And I did a 10-day Vipassana. I've done a few of them, and I remember I was like, she's so similar to me because I've struggled with food addiction my whole life. And I remember being in that 10-day Vipassana, and I couldn't wait to get the apple for dinner and the tea, you know, and I'm just like such a little pleasure person. And that's definitely my type, is the pleasure type. And so before we dive into the sister of pleasure, which is death, how have you, if you have, and if not, where are you with this now, found that spiritual practice enabled you to heal or begin to heal your relationship with pleasure and food specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of women in this culture just struggle with this combination of policing themselves rigorously around food, and then kind of they throw their hat off and it's all sheets to the wind and they just eat, right? And that was certainly true for me. I'm not a pleasure type. I'm a police yourself, austerity type.
Wow.
And which, of course, then is always the chaos that emerges from too much of that. I I think that first experience that you talked about, where I went to a very strict Rinzai retreat, Sesshin, and I was completely out of my element. And it was so tough. And we were doing walking meditation at 3:30 in the morning with the moon out. It was beautiful. And it was also, I slipped in the mud, I fell, I fainted in the zendo because I was chanting without breathing. No, it was a disaster. And I just stumbled again. I like stumbled into something that was so far above my pay grade. But I will never forget that moment of that first bite of brown rice, that I could actually taste it, and that all of these practices and demands on me had occupied my extremely strong thinking mind enough that I could get into the body and be ambushed by my own senses.
Mm.
And that was a glimmer of what was wrong with me, that so little of my life felt like that mouthful of brown rice. And you could, about the food and also just about life, drinking in pleasure, the sensuality of the world.
Mm.
But when I was on retreat, I'd also lived with Thich Nhat Hanh's community in southern France for 9 months and went to many retreats there. When I was in a very stable Buddhist environment where the food was basically vegetarian and basically healthy on the whole, I didn't have nearly the struggles I had when I was in lay life. And in lay life, I mean, we often hear about this, how people can have an incredible retreat and then it's after enlightenment, the laundry. And I would come home and I would come into my own chaotic approach to food, which was everything. It was binging, it was purging, it was dieting, it was restricting. And what helped me was a 12-step program, not my Buddhist practice. But I do feel that the 12-step program gave me another pathway into spirituality that was a very important balance for me to Buddhist practices that, as we know, have excluded women for most of millennia on the whole. Thich Nhat Hanh was very much about getting into the body, that your body's your home, your breath is your home. And if you're feeling upset, come back to your breath, come back to your breath. But those practices alone could not help me deal with what I consider my food addiction.
Mm.
And I needed the really homegrown, homespun folk wisdom of a bunch of women, some of whom have been enormously heavy and some of whom had been anorexic and some of whom, like me, had been bulimic and restricting and capable of staying in the closet with it, but not having a happy life. It took that combined folk wisdom and the community of being in community with other women. And I think it's just shedding shame that the program I'm in, which I'm not going to name because of traditions, obviously it's not all women, but it's predominantly women. And to me, telling one's story is a very important spiritual practice, especially for women, because I think we can release the shame we feel. Maybe it's the shame about how we eat or how our body looks or the bad experiences we had earlier in life that might have turned us toward an addictive relationship with food. I just, for the last 20 years, I've been listening to women tell their stories and telling my own story and listen to it change even, develop different narratives. And I think that's been tremendously healing. And being in community, because, Buddhism's relatively new to the United States. A lot of us tend to go on a retreat and then we come home and there's kind of a disjunction between our home life and our spiritual, intense retreat. And at least for me, it was much easier over time to really embrace a community within the 12-step movement.
Beautiful. Yeah, I really feel like, I started off in the tantric tradition, Sri Vidya, also a very, very, despite it purporting to be a worship of the Divine Mother, it was taught by men and there was lots of shenanigans. And,
Yeah.
I very much like revere the teachings and even those teachers who were imperfect beings, right? But it's been amazing to watch the way that the teachings themselves don't know that we've given them names and put them in boxes. And, and I kind of, just the very brief version of my story was going from this like very traditional tantric Sri Vidya, chanting the names of the Divine Mother over and over again for hours and hours. There's a quality of, even though it's quote tantra, there's so much misunderstanding about that. And it's actually quite a policed, rigorous, disciplined tradition, right? That then creates a lot of rigidity in the system. And I think all of us in the community, whether it be yoga or meditation, Buddhism, Hinduism, we're realizing that we left the mothering out of this. We left the divine feminine out of even those of us who were studying, quote, divine feminine. We're leaving that quality of the intuitive that can only emerge out of the spontaneous and the individual. And so it's funny now, I've been studying with a trauma-based therapist for 7 years. And I'm like, wow, I'm touching into things that my meditation practice of 20 years never touched.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a real healing in something like a 12-step program or a more folksy type thing. And listeners out there, Katy is also a renowned writer in the field of death and dying. I'm curious if we can sort of pivot to how you got interested in writing 2 books on death and dying for our listeners.
Thank you. I just want to put in one footnote before we move on, which is the place I first started to really, truly find my voice in a public way. I was at Zen Center. There was a major, major sexual scandal, one of many, where women were abused and their desire for enlightenment and spiritual growth was abused by and misused by teachers sexually. So that was actually where it really began for me, finding my voice in sort of the journalistic world, because I wrote exposés about it at great cost. Again, I think so much just comes out of my lived experience. I was a very experienced journalist. I'd done a lot of investigative reporting. I'd written for the New York Times, etc. And my father had a major stroke, and within a year or so was given a pacemaker that then prolonged his life into the most horrible, desperate time when he had dementia and also exhausted my mother, who was his full-time caregiver for 7 years. And I've always had a very independent streak, very critical thinking. I was born in South Africa and raised partly in England, so I always look askance at this culture a little bit. And it was like, why are we not talking about the fact that this man's approaching the end of his life? Why aren't we talking about the fact that he's outlived his happiness? And you've now put a technological device in him that we can't even figure out what the exit plan is. Like when we get to the point where his life is no longer worth living to him, he's got this device forcing his heart to beat, okay? Mm-hmm. And so it came out of this gut understanding of my own family and the suffering I saw my mother and him, and I suppose me, go through during these 7 years, where it just exploded in my love for him and my concern for both of them and my connection with them. So it wasn't all bad, but I just thought, what's wrong with this health system? Why aren't we talking about this? And then, so I wrote a book called Knocking on Heaven's Door, listening to Bob Dylan all the way while I was writing it. And then after that, I realized I need a guide for the later years of my own life. And so I wrote another book called The Art of Dying Well, which is really very much a nuts and bolts guide to like what to expect and how to help people. So I often come to my interests journalistically or in writing through my own lived experience. And this was just so intense and such a contrast. And I realized, I mean, as I said, I'm the daughter of immigrants, so I didn't have grandparents around. I didn't see, they died in South Africa. We just got a letter, I didn't see death and dying up close very much. And yet I was always very curious about it. I remember holding funerals with my brother's stuffed animals when we were kids. So I've had some kind of innate intrigue about it. And then I think we're just in a society that because we live in a very individualistic and competitive society. And so people tend to feel they've been failures if they get sick, if they die, or if they're a doctor taking care of someone whose illness is incurable. I think there's a lot of warding off both the fear and horror of death, but also this feeling of not having been good enough, not having done it well enough. And I think, as you know from Buddhism, when you try to avoid a certain kind of suffering that needs to be faced, you get it again with interest. It just comes back
Amen.
and hits you 5 times as powerfully. And that's, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say there's a beautiful, I'm a little bit of a neophyte in the Buddhist world. I'm suddenly very interested in it because my therapist is really into Tibetan Tantra, and Pema Chodron is one of her teachers. And I've been really, really close with the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh all my life. He was one of my early influences spiritually. But I recently discovered, and we've kind of been working with this in my community at the Shakti School, of these 5 Buddhist remembrances, which, if listeners don't know, they are, every human being is going to get ill. Every human being.
Do you mind if I interrupt you and give you my version? It's the
Do
Thich
it.
Nhat Hanh version.
I would be so honored because I'm butchering it. Yes, give me your version.
Well, you're not butchering it. I am of the nature to grow old. There's nothing I can do to prevent growing old. I am of the nature to get sick. There's nothing I can do to prevent getting sick. I am of the nature to die. There's nothing I can do to prevent my death. Everything and everyone I love will eventually be separated from me. My deeds are my only companions. They are the ground on which I stand. I just love that. And I include that actually in the, I think it's in the second, no, I don't know which book it's in, but
like as you start to chant it or speak initially, and I can watch my students' faces becoming depressed and grim, but then as you really consider these things, you can feel the prana, you can feel the energy of the room starting to open as we all get busted out of this illusion that we're all walking around in, that something here is solid. And that last line, it's like, the way I had learned it was, my only true belongings are my actions.
Yeah.
And like in that we have capacity and we have choice. And there's actually a lot of freedom in these 5 remembrances.
Yeah. And to balance it, it's also natural and understandable that we have grief when we lose the people that we love. Because whatever you think about what comes next or don't think, the fact is, on this plane, we lose them, we miss them, we grieve them. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's an expression of our capacity for love and attachment, and that too is important, and I think is sometimes sort of soft pedaled in Buddhism, And again, as women, I don't know, it feels we're very contextual, we're very relational, and it's important. I first heard those I was living in Thich Nhat Hanh's community in southern France, and we would recite them every morning, and I was in my early 40s, and they really went over my head. I mean, I recited them, and I also did what you may have done also, these Vipassana practices where you imagine all the components of your body, you imagine them all separating, you imagine your own death, you imagine your body rotting in the charnel ground and then turning to bone and turning to dust. And I found that a very, very helpful practice in terms of, how important is it not taking everything so seriously. If you have some interpersonal conflict with somebody else at a retreat, how much does that really matter when 50 years from now we're going to be bones and dust, So I think it's I love the remembrances because again, it sort of takes away the blame or the shame or the feeling that, like I think you said on your last podcast, that if I just take all the right supplements and I'm doing my yoga and everything I'm supposed to do, I'm somehow going to avoid all this. Because I mean, all those things are really important because they give you a good life in aging. But if we think we're going to get like, get out of jail for free card, no, we're not. You know?
It reminds me what we're talking about. I'm sure you're well aware of like the Carl Jungian nature of what we're talking about in terms of these what feel like opposites. There's this tension of being able to hold what feels like paradoxical concepts at the same time. And what I try to share with students and try to practice is like, we've been trained that there is a right way of doing things, that I'm going to get an A+. I don't want an F. I'm very success motivated. I'm sure you are as well. Like my students are like, they want to know what is the right way. And like, when we confront something like death or our own addictions or our interpersonal traumas and relationships, the way that healing I've seen happen actually comes from opening to the feeling of being a failure without demonizing that, because the ego can play such wily little tricks that like, it's like, okay, now I'm on the, like, now I'm a Buddhist and I'm on the non-attachment project and look how good I am at non-attachment, or, and so it's such a subtle razor edge sword that we're walking, of opening our heart to our foibles and imbalances, while at the same time not letting ourselves eat 16 ice cream Klondike bars tonight because I feel like, you know what I'm trying to say?
Oh, I do. And I just feel like, it seems more like life seems more like a river or a tapestry. And I just am more and more aware, like nobody's good or bad. And like you said, there's no right or wrong. I wish there were bumper stickers we could just follow and everything would be fine. And people are not consistent. There are people who have all kinds of beautiful qualities, and then at a bad moment or in a secret part of their life, they're really horrible,
We
and
are,
it
we
includes,
are.
yeah, we are. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. Right. Exactly.
When you were witnessing your father's death,
Yeah.
you said something that I really want to come back to. It felt like a pocket of something pretty powerful. And that was that in that really challenging period, you had this opening into love.
Yeah.
Based on your experience, but also generally for everyone, what can death teach us about that level of opening?
Oh boy. I don't know. I want to answer a different question. You asked me like, what is a good death?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I was thinking about it before we got on. And I was thinking a good death is a death where people are well supported and they get the chance to be themselves as they're dying.
I love that.
And there's a long, long tradition called the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying, that goes back to the 1400s, where they first started to produce, literally in the 1400s, self-help books on how to die. I think partly because it was just after the Black Death and
I was going to say, is it
there weren't enough priests to go around, all right? And so there's a whole ritual of treating death as a spiritual ritual and a spiritual ordeal, which we've kind of lost because death has become so materialistic, so technologically oriented. People don't even know if they're dying now, whereas in the Middle Ages, people would say things like, send for the priest, I know I'm going to die within the next 24 hours, or don't send for the priest yet, I'm not there yet. I mean, people were much more
they were tuned to their energy.
intuitive to their body because they didn't have much else, right?
Mm.
And I think there's a danger of trying to make death a spiritual performance. Like some people are going to leave this world watching the Red Sox and eating ice cream, and some people are going to leave protesting till the last minute that they're not going to die. Like my husband was a caregiver to a very dear friend, and hospice said she was the worst patient they had ever had in their life, and she was arguing with everybody and criticizing everybody and just absolutely hell-bent on saying that she was not going to die, until about 3 or 4 days before her death, when she did let Brian help her and a couple other people plan her funeral, So, and of course, given all the technology we have, I feel it's so important that we now really have the possibility for good pain control around death and dying. And I know 2 people who died of pancreatic cancer. And one was a guy whose wife did everything she could to make sure he was not going to die, and he had a fatal illness. And then he finally went on hospice maybe 2 weeks before he died. And they gave him methadone, which is a very powerful painkiller. And also keeps your mind clear, but it's very dangerous. You really have to know. Someone has to really know what they're doing, like a hospice nurse who's a pain control expert. And he said, if I had been on methadone a year ago, I could have continued to work as a lawyer. His whole, death is a long process, especially in this culture now, because we can delay it a lot. It's like you think about approaching your own death, it could be like a 1-year project, could be more. You're on the toboggan slide, but you're going slowly. And I guess my great wish for this culture is that people could be more willing to get on hospice a lot earlier, and that we also would have a palliative care benefit, which was just as good as hospice and lasted a year. So people could really concentrate on quality of life as they're dying. So I don't want death to be a spiritual performance, but I did find when I was writing the second book, Art of Dying Well, that I really saw the importance of bringing in homegrown ritual any way and any place that you can. I do little altars for people,
I love
flowers.
that you
Yeah.
said people die watching the Red Sox. That brought tears to my eyes because, and that death doesn't need to be a spiritual performance. I think that is tantra.
Uh-huh.
That there is divinity in. I could just see my dad. My father almost died during COVID, and it was during the period where we couldn't really visit people. It was a big ordeal, and when he came out, he said that he looked up at the wallpaper in the room. He came out of open heart surgery, had 2 of them, 2 back to back, really scary stuff. And he looked up at the wallpaper, and it was this really cheesy, like palm trees, in a hospital. And my dad is like a Southern man, doesn't cry, never seen him cry, literally never seen my father cry. And he teared up and he said, that wallpaper was so beautiful.
Wow. Wow.
And I can imagine
Wow.
my father will die watching a UT football game, University of Tennessee, and that the divinity in that sweetness of what's actually real.
Yeah.
And that there is divinity in these emotional states that inevitably death brings us to.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a beautiful series, again, I think it's another 5 hospice sort of end of life spiritual tasks. Let me see. God, if I can remember them now. Oh, it's saying to people, thank you. I love you. Please forgive me. I forgive you. And goodbye. And
Wow.
I think a lot of people, my mother did versions of this intuitively as she was approaching her death. And I think those of us who are not dying, but are witnessing or relating or supporting someone who's dying, it's good to have those in the back of our mind, not to try to enforce them on the dying person, but to look for opportunities to subtly bring those into a conversation,
Also, just writing on what you were saying about death and our culture being so individualistic and success driven, which those are all worthy goals, but when they're decoupled from also our deep collectivism, it becomes so lame in the sense of just not able to walk. And
Yeah.
we need both. And I'm remembering another author I was talking to who said that your death is also for those who will remain after you're gone.
I feel that very strongly.
So maybe speak to me about how you've seen a quote, good death lead to the capacity for those who are left behind to have their own experience around it be something more helpful and healing than what many of us have, which is, oh my God, I have to go through my mom's entire, hoarder's chest.
Yeah, well, my own mother was pretty amazing. She was also a Zen Buddhist and very a gardener, just a very faced life very truthfully. Not an easy person by any means for anybody, including herself. But and this is something I write about, that we really need to think about our emotional legacy. And so that when we face the things that we're scared of, like our death or the approach of death or opening up a difficult conversation with a doctor who's not eager to have it, we're not only doing it for ourselves, we're definitely doing it for those that remain. And that's why I really, it's not this podcast, but I really emphasize how important it is for people to sign things like the 5 wishes, which are, advance directives, and to be clear with their kids, even if the kids don't want to talk about it, about how much is too much. And when they want to say, don't put me into ICU another time, don't give me a feeding tube. These are nitty gritty, not particularly
No, I
beautiful
love that
details.
you should
Yeah.
bring these up. Like, our listeners need to know we don't talk
Yeah.
about this, and we need to get these things in line.
You need to get it in line, partly because enormous amount of sibling conflict occurs after a death if there's not some clarity about this. And it can still occur even if there is clarity. But if you know that mom said, if I can't talk, I don't want to be revived. I don't want to come back to so-called life. If I have dementia, I definitely don't want a feeding tube. I don't want you to put me on antibiotics. I want you to put me on painkillers and let me, pneumonia used to be called the old man's friend. And, there comes a point where it's very important to deviate from business as usual, because you will be on a conveyor belt. If you just turn yourself over to the medical system, you'll be on a conveyor belt to every last ditch maneuver possible until somebody says no.
Wow.
The doctors are often silently waiting and hoping that you or your family is going to say no more. Not.
Well, and I've
And
even
they
heard
don't know how to broach that.
what
Yeah.
shifted my mind around this, and I have an advanced medical directive already after doing this research, that doctors statistically want none of these interventions, and nurses, precisely because they've actually seen them. And they see how harmful these are to your death experience as well as to the physical body. And so I thought, I don't want anything that the doctors and nurses don't want.
Wouldn't want themselves. I know.
Right.
But they often feel that they're kind of obliged to offer, the lack of skillful communication in medicine is truly a tragedy. Okay. But I want to go back to my mother's death, if you don't
Yes,
mind.
please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my mother I think she called me not long before she died, like within the last week. She called and said, "Oh, Katie, I found this beautiful little book you created for I think it was her 80th birthday. Yeah, 80th birthday. And I was so unappreciative, you know? And it was her way of saying, I'm so sorry. And I could take it as a sorry for every other form of pain she ever caused me, And she also had this rally, like people often have this rally shortly before they die, where they just kind of flower and they have energy. And sometimes family members think they're getting better, but they're not. It's part of the dying process. And she called me and she said, because I've been living with my then boyfriend, Brian, for like, I don't know, 20 years, 15 years. And she said, cherish Brian. I love Brian. I love Brian for what he has done for you. And I said, do you mean stop being such a snob and cherish Brian? She said, yes, that's exactly what I mean. Because, I love this man and he has always loved me, but I'd always held him a little bit at like arm's length. And those dying words for me were incredibly important. I mean, I am married to Brian now, and I am totally happy with him. And she gave me her blessing, basically. And then she declined open heart surgery because she was afraid she would have a stroke the way my father had, and she didn't want to be a debilitated, independent person. It was not her personality. So she declined open heart surgery. 5 months later, she had a heart attack. And then after the heart attack, went on hospice, was offered a whole bunch of more or less ditch interventions. And I said, what are you guys talking about? She rejected all this stuff when she was much healthier and hadn't just had a heart attack. And now you want to do it now when she's even weaker? She was 85. And then, like, my brothers went to see her. She was on oxygen. She was at home on hospice for about a month. And then she had what was probably another heart attack, some other big turn for the worst. And they took her to the hospital, and she said, I want to take off my earrings, and I want to die, and I don't want to go home. And the hospice, so they put her in a hospice unit. The hospice nurse said, you don't have to take off your earrings. This is a hospice unit. You can wear whatever you want. And she essentially said, I want to get rid of all the garbage. And I think that was her way of saying, naked I came into this world, and naked I will return. And then she sent off my brother to call my other brother and I, who were both in California, unfortunately. And she died in the 20 minutes he was away calling us. So she just died so cleanly. I mean, she was a real warrior. She was a warrior. She had that kind of samurai energy.
What an image. Take my earrings, I'm going to die. It reminds me of the very first women's myth story of Inanna and the underworld. Well, Katie, she has to go down to the 7 layers of the underworld, which is death, basically.
Okay.
What we're talking about. And of course, psychologically, it's the subconscious. But when she gets to the gate, the guard first says to her, a woman, queen of the universe, who do you think you are? Under whose authority are you here? Like, who's your daddy?
Uh-huh.
And basically, he makes her give him her earrings.
Wow.
So she takes off her jewelry, and then of course she's
Yeah.
queen, so she has all this accoutrement. And through each 7 layers, she has to remove a piece of her clothing until she gets to the 7th layer, and she's totally naked.
Wow.
And there's a whole rebirth. But
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like one of the great gifts of the realization, like death sits with me as a constant companion on my shoulder each morning as I rise, because if I live with death like a small little wolf on my shoulder, reminding me of that, it actually enables me to have less attachment to these things that I can get really caught up in. Like, should I get these boots? It's like suddenly when you feel the truth of death, even if you're totally healthy, and I'm 44,
Yeah, yeah.
it really does bring everything into perspective and takes the sparkle out of these temporary things a little bit. I'm not going to lie, but I think that it brings you into contact with this deeper layer, right, of what actually matters.
I think so. And for me, it's both a sharpening of my love of life,
Mm.
my ability to be present and enjoy a walk around the neighborhood or whatever, and hopefully more understanding of the importance of kindness, the importance of how I relate to other people, because of those 5 remembrances. It's like if you're going to lose everything and lose everybody, like, why not be kind in the meantime? It doesn't matter that much, and our kindnesses to other people really do matter. You just never know when you're kind to somebody and they really take it to heart, and you forget about it, but they remember, and it sustains them, you know?
Mm. I think a place I want to end with you, if it feels okay, Katie, is you've studied death, you've written 2 books. One of your books is a practical how to. I know everyone's going to run out and buy it. I certainly am going to, because I want that in my arsenal
Mhm.
when I need it. But it seems to me that all this study on death has led you to this moment now. I can just, maybe my intuition's wrong, but you're 76 and we got on the call and Katie's like, hey, I was Googling you and Tantra and sex, spirit, self-care. And I thought, oh my God. And I could see this light and radiance of like a 25-year-old. I'm curious how your relationship to studying so much Buddhism, which can be quite a V yoga, we call it like a separation practice, led you to being interested in women and their bodies now.
Yeah, well, to quote Bonnie Raitt, life gets kind of precious when there's less of it to waste. So I'm 76. I'm in my second marriage, long second marriage. And I see us decaying. It's obvious. My knees hurt. Brian forgets, I can tell Brian something and he forgets I ever said a word about it. So, and our energy isn't the same. We have to ration and manage our energy so much more carefully. And I was traumatized as a 7-year-old. I was molested by a stranger one time, but it changed my whole life, which I'm sure you understand. And so I had a very checkered sexual career in my teens and 20s where I had all kinds of sex that I did not enjoy, and I had no voice. I couldn't talk about when it hurt. I couldn't talk about when it felt good. I couldn't say no. It was a disaster. And now here I am in my 70s, and I'm in a beautifully stable and extremely safe relationship. And I feel like I am still finding my voice in the bedroom, finding my voice in bed, and so happy to still be sexual. And like Brian's touch has changed completely from when we first met. Like we first met in our early 50s. And he'd been in a Catholic seminary when he was a teenager, so he had missed out completely on all the stuff that I had had way too much of. And he had this sort of unskilled eagerness of a boy, a teenager who was grabbing for breasts and, getting to second base. And it was horrible. It wasn't very sexual. It was awful. And over time, he now has the most beautiful touch in the world, this slow, aware touch, partly because we did do several tantric sex workshops with Charles Muir and learned to give each other massage before we make love. And, we don't have as much sex as we would have had 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but the sex we have is so much better. I mean, like, we have a ritual. I bring him coffee in bed at least 2 mornings a week. And I did this morning. And, just to feel his hand, stroke down my shoulder. I mean, he's sexier to me than half of the young guys I slept with when I was young. So hold on, women. There's a lot to look forward to.
Oh, Katie.
It can get better and better and better. It really can.
I'm just getting emotional. I don't know if you can see it. Like, you guys, we are being given a blessing right now from Katie. Like, so many women need to hear this.
Yeah. And it's so interrelated. Like everything we've been talking about, I guess I keep talking about the dark and the light and the oppositions, but it's like the better boundaries I have with him, and the more clear I am on what doesn't work, or don't pester me for sex. I don't want to hear about sex, 7 days a week, Let's make love on Sundays. That's when we make love. The rest of the time, leave me alone or kiss me, or we can make out, but we're not going to have sex,
God, I love it. Katie, I have to share this with you. In the tantric tradition, they talk about the woman and the man, when they were married, lived in separate wings, and you would all week long, for the women's 30-day hormone, you would flirt with your man for those first 3 weeks, and you would tinkle little bells and, have little flirtations. Like you said, make out with me. And they would meet in the middle. And then for the final 3 days when she was ovulating, they would have sex for 3 days. And they would never leave lovemaking chamber, but they would actually sleep and be separate. And I think there's so much power in that.
There really is, and I found a cabin up in Salmon Creek, California, and I go away to write there. And Brian is heartbroken that I don't want him to come. But it's like I brought him one time. It was a huge mistake. It's like I need my sacred female body-oriented writing and intuitive space. I mean, it's right on practically on the beach. I can hear the waves pound. I can walk on the beach, but it needs to be mine and separate. So I don't know, there's lots of irony in this, but we have really, and I'm lucky because I have an amazing and very, very loving partner. And if I say, something hurts or it's time to do something different or change or move differently or whatever, or stop, he's always like, thank you, thank you for telling me what you need. It can't be great for both of us if it's not great for you. So I do feel I mean, when I was in my 50s and I first met him, that was also kind of a teenage time because I was learning how to date again. I'd come out of very severe chronic pain. It was a real rebirth, which I guess happens to a lot of women right around perimenopause, that they have this re-teenagehood or something. So I had it when we first met, and then I really do feel I've had it in the last 3 or 4 years, that there's been, I mean, it started when we first went to a Tantra workshop and learned, I think one of the things he said was men are like blowtorches and women are like ovens. And I feel that in my 20s, I felt there was something wrong with me because I wasn't a blowtorch. And I felt the whole emphasis of sexuality during the so-called sexual revolution, which it was a bust for women, as far as I'm concerned, was to try to get on a man's timetable and to do things the way it comes naturally to men. And that totally doesn't serve sensuality and sexuality and pleasure and orgasm for women. Right. So I feel I was very lucky to do things like the Height Report, which I don't know if you even know about it, but it was a whole book of just women telling their stories about what worked for them in bed.
When was that?
Oh, it's probably early 80s or late 70s. Yeah, go look it up.
That's when I was born.
Yeah.
We'll put it in the show notes. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know what it's like for young women now, but I suspect it's no better. I don't think it's
not. I mean,
yeah, it may be worse.
I'm around them and I'm 44 and I feel like we need to have you. I think we need to have you come and be a guest speaker. And we have a community called Spirit Sessions, which is a gathering that we do for 2 hours each month so we can continue the conversation. I just feel like you're such a reservoir of wisdom and experience. And I just feel like you've given me an injection of hope in a conversation mostly related to addiction and death. And that, there is this false idea that like it's over for you. It gives me hope.
Oh yeah. And may I say one parting word?
Of course.
Just to everybody, whoever listens to it, which is find ways to tell your story. Find ways to tell your story in contexts that are safe for you. And that is going to be different for different people. It could be that it's just a journal that you keep because you can't share yet with anybody. But I just think that that's a huge key to being able to continue to grow as a human being and to start to integrate all the parts of yourself and accept them all.
Find ways to tell your story. Katy, tell us about your 2 books and tell us your offerings.
Okay, so The Art of Dying Well is the book that's most recent. And this is a book that gets handed from hand to hand and also used in spiritual communities like Spirit Rock and also churches, because a lot of places now are doing, like maybe a 6-month series of workshops on preparing for death. And so this is wonderful. It's all nuts and bolts, and I think very helpful. And you can order it at your independent bookstore, or you can also get it on Amazon or whatever. And then the other one is Knocking on Heaven's Door. This is the first book about my family experience going through the deaths of my 2 parents and really challenging modern medicine for its loss of the sacred in its rush toward technology. And this was a New York Times notable book of the year, and it was also a New York Times bestseller. So I'm very proud of it. But I think The Art of Dying Well is probably, if you want to read a wonderful book, read Knocking on Heaven's Door. But if you want a lot of practical help, I think The Art of Dying Well is really, really helpful. So if you know someone you know is likely to be facing their deaths within the next couple of years, or if you're aging yourself, because it really starts with healthy aging and goes all the way through to the end of life. Yeah, there's a lot of accumulative wisdom, especially in the second book, that's not necessarily mine, that comes from hospice nurses and professionals, as well as from people who've gone through real experiences. So thank you.
Katy, thank you. I'm going to be getting those 2 books. And I also want to thank the Tricycle magazine for introducing me to your work and your lovely writing. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and my community. And I think everyone's going to get a lot out of this. Really. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I feel we had a really heart-to-heart connection, and that just interacting with you helped me come more alive. So I appreciate it. I feel great now, and that's a lovely thing to feel.
Wonderful.
Okay, take care, Katy. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
A big special thanks to Kevin Carlisle of Goodbye Gemini, who wrote this beautiful podcast music, and to DJ Juan Pablo Jimenez in southern Spain for mixing it and making it magic.